When the cable ship Mackay Bennett pulled John Jacob Astor IV's body from the North Atlantic on April 22, 1912, they found $2,500 in cash still in his pockets and a gold watch stopped at 2:20 a.m., the exact moment RMS Titanic disappeared beneath the waves. The richest man to die in the disaster left behind an $87 million fortune, a 19-year-old pregnant widow, and a 20-year-old son who would spend the next 49 years trying to build monuments that could justify inheriting wealth purchased with his father's death. Vincent Astor's life became a study in how survivors' guilt and inherited trauma can poison even unlimited resources, transforming a Hudson River estate called Ferncliff into a symbol of everything the Gilded Age couldn't preserve, not from economic forces, but from the psychological weight of unearned inheritance and impossible expectations. This is the true story of how Titanic insurance money built a legacy that nobody wanted and a family line that chose extinction over continuation. The Astor fortune began with fur pelts, Manhattan real estate, and tactics that made competitors call John Jacob Astor IV the landlord of New York. Born in Germany in 1763, he arrived in America in 1784 with 7 flutes to sell and approximately $25. Within 16 years, he controlled 90% of the American fur trade through methods that included undercutting competitors, bribing officials, and establishing trading posts that created regional monopolies. When the fur market collapsed, he pivoted with prophetic timing to New York real estate, buying farmland that became Times Square, purchasing foreclosed properties during financial panics, and accumulating over 700 buildings before his death in 1848. His $20 million fortune made him America's first multimillionaire. His great-grandson, John Jacob Astor IV, born in 1864, inherited not just wealth, but the family expectation of dominance in both business and society. But John Jacob IV was fundamentally different from typical Gilded Age heirs. He spoke 5 languages fluently, held patents for bicycle brakes and improved ship turbines, wrote a science fiction novel called A Journey in Other Worlds about life in the year 2000, and preferred his laboratory to ballrooms. He built the Astoria Hotel in 1897 not as vanity, but as engineering challenge, incorporating electrical systems and modern plumbing that made it technologically advanced. Society whispered that he was too clever for his own good, a dangerous trait in an era valuing breeding over brilliance. His 1891 marriage to Ava Lowell Willing produced 2 children and maintained social appearances, but the union was loveless from the start. The crisis that defined John Jacob Astor IV's later life began with divorce in 1909, scandalous enough among New York's elite, but escalated dramatically when he announced his engagement to 18-year-old Madeline Talmadge Force in 1911. The age gap alone would have raised eyebrows, but Madeline was a full year younger than Astor's son Vincent, making the situation socially catastrophic. Society matrons stopped sending invitations. The Astors were systematically cut from guest lists at balls they had once dominated. Even family members publicly expressed disapproval. Newport shunned them. Philadelphia society closed ranks. John Jacob Astor IV, one of America's wealthiest men with bloodlines traced to the Mayflower through his mother, found himself socially exiled, despite, or perhaps because of, his fortune. The rejection was deliberate and comprehensive. Caroline Astor, the legendary Mrs. Astor, who had defined New York society for decades, was John Jacob's aunt, and even she maintained icy distance. The message was clear: money couldn't buy acceptance when you violated unwritten codes. So Astor made a decision that sealed his fate. He would take his young bride on an extended European honeymoon, waiting for scandal to fade, then return to expand his Rhinebeck estate into something so magnificent that society would be forced to acknowledge them. He called the property Ferncliff, after the ferns covering much of the Hudson River acreage he'd been acquiring since the 1890s. Ferncliff's history dated to 1902, when John Jacob Astor IV commissioned Stanford White, America's most celebrated architect, to design a country retreat on 300 acres overlooking the Hudson, near Rhinebeck, New York. White created a Beaux-Arts masterpiece called Astor Courts, featuring a main building with indoor tennis court, elaborate entertaining spaces, swimming pool, and quarters for guests and staff. The complex cost $2 million, approximately $65 million today, and represented Astor's vision of a sporting estate where he could pursue his engineering hobbies away from Manhattan society. But the 1906 murder of Stanford White by Harry Kendall Thor over White's affair with Evelyn Nesbit created scandal that tainted the property by association. Astor had been expanding Ferncliff steadily, purchasing adjacent farms until the estate grew to over 2,000 acres by 1910. He commissioned additional buildings, greenhouses, model farms, and installed experimental electrical systems. His vision was evolving. Ferncliff would become a self-contained world where his new family with Madeline could live beyond society's judgment, a place where his son Vincent could learn estate management, where Madeline could raise children in beauty rather than scorn. During their European honeymoon in early 1912, with Madeline pregnant, Astor sketched expansion plans: more guest cottages, larger stables, a dedicated laboratory building. He wrote to his estate manager about purchasing additional acreage and planning construction to begin in spring 1913. The decision to return to America in April 1912 came from business necessity. Astor's managers sent urgent telegrams about properties requiring his attention, tenants defaulting, and investment opportunities demanding immediate presence. Against his preference for slower passage, he booked the most expensive suite on RMS Titanic's maiden voyage, partly for prestige of the newest luxury liner, partly because Madeline, 5 months pregnant, wanted to return before becoming too uncomfortable for travel. They paid $350 for one-way crossing, approximately $133,000 in modern currency, and boarded at Cherbourg on April 10th. Fellow first-class passengers noted how solicitous Astor was toward his young wife, walking her around the promenade deck each afternoon, how he seemed lighter than the dour figure New York knew. On the night of April 14th, when Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., Astor initially dismissed danger. He had studied ship design extensively and believed the vessel's compartmentalized hull made sinking impossible. Only when he felt the ship's pronounced list did he escort Madeline to the boat deck. At 2:05 a.m., as Lifeboat 4 prepared to launch, Astor helped his wife climb in, then asked Second Officer Charles Lightoller if he could accompany her given her delicate condition. Lightoller refused. No men are allowed in these boats until the women are loaded first. Astor stepped back without protest and asked only which lifeboat number she was taking. Those were his final words to her. His body was recovered a week later, identified by initials sewn into his jacket and $20,500 cash in his pockets. He was 47 years old. The aftermath transformed Vincent Astor overnight from wealthy young man to head of America's greatest real estate dynasty. At 20 years old, still at Harvard, he inherited approximately $69 million in trust, roughly $2.1 billion today, plus direct control of income-generating properties worth millions more. But the will's structure revealed his father's concerns about Vincent's readiness. The bulk of the estate went into trust until Vincent turned 25, with 3 trustees controlling major decisions. Vincent received $1 million annually, about $30 million today, but couldn't touch principal. The will also provided generously for Madeline, $100,000 annually, plus occupancy of the Fifth Avenue mansion, with one devastating provision. If she remarried, she forfeited everything and lost custody rights to the unborn child. On August 14, 1912, Madeline gave birth to John Jacob Astor IV. The delivery was difficult, complicated by grief and relentless press attention. Vincent, suddenly managing the vast empire while processing his father's death, found himself responsible not just for properties, but for his father's unfulfilled dreams. Among papers in his father's safe were expansion plans for Ferncliff, correspondence with architects about new buildings, and notes about creating a legacy beyond society's small judgments. Vincent faced a choice: abandon his father's vision or complete it as memorial. He chose remembrance, but his motives were complex. Vincent Astor's decision to expand Ferncliff was driven by multiple psychological forces. The Titanic disaster had generated unprecedented media attention, much focused on wealthy passengers who survived while steerage passengers drowned. Though Vincent hadn't been aboard, the Astor name faced criticism that family wealth had guaranteed Madeline a seat while poorer passengers perished. Vincent, educated at Harvard and St. George's School, saw Ferncliff's expansion as family rehabilitation, demonstrating that Astors were builders and job creators rather than idle rich. But his private writings reveal darker motivation. His diary from summer 1912 records, "I dream of his face in the water every night. Mother says work is the cure for grief. Perhaps if I finish what he began, the dreams will stop." Multiple doctors diagnosed severe anxiety and recommended activity as therapy. Expanding Ferncliff became obsession. But Vincent made a crucial decision that differed from his father's plans. Rather than building a private palace, he would create a working estate that demonstrated modern agricultural methods, scientific forestry, and model farm management. This shift from pure luxury to productive enterprise reflected Vincent's engineering mindset and perhaps unconscious recognition that Gilded Age excess was ending. Between 1913 and 1920, he invested approximately $3 million, roughly $90 million today, expanding Ferncliff into one of America's most sophisticated estates. The construction campaign Vincent launched transformed Ferncliff from gentleman's sporting retreat into comprehensive agricultural operation. He hired Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., son of the legendary landscape architect, to design a master plan integrating the existing Astor courts with new facilities. Olmsted was 42, attempting to step from his father's shadow, and saw Ferncliff as opportunity to demonstrate that estates could be beautiful and productive simultaneously. Vincent also retained Delano and Aldrich, the architectural firm favored by old money families, to design additional buildings in styles complementing Stanford White's Beaux-Arts originals. The building program was extensive. A model dairy barn complex for 150 Holstein cattle, incorporating the latest sanitation equipment and ventilation systems, costing $185,000, a poultry operation housing 3,000 chickens in scientifically designed coops with electric lighting and temperature control. Greenhouses covering over an acre under glass, producing flowers, vegetables, and experimental crops year-round. Additional guest cottages for weekend visitors, built in Tudor Revival style with modern plumbing and electric heating, expansion of the garage complex to house Vincent's growing automobile collection, which would eventually include over 40 vehicles. A dedicated laboratory building where Vincent could pursue his interest in experimental agriculture and mechanical engineering, and renovation of existing buildings to incorporate new electrical and heating systems powered by the estate's own generating plant. The agricultural operations Vincent established weren't mere hobby farming. They were serious commercial enterprises designed to demonstrate that great estates could be economically productive. The dairy herd produced milk sold commercially under the Ferncliff Farms label, generating approximately $75,000 annually in revenue. The poultry operation sold eggs and dressed chickens to New York markets. The greenhouses supplied flowers to Manhattan florists and hotels. Vincent hired agricultural experts from Cornell University to manage operations, paying premium salaries to attract genuine talent rather than decorative farmers. He installed modern equipment constantly, mechanical milking machines when they became available, electric brooders for chicks, motorized cultivators for the extensive vegetable gardens. The estate employed between 150 and 200 workers year-round, making it one of the region's largest employers. Vincent established worker housing with amenities unusual for the era, modern cottages with electricity and indoor plumbing, a recreation hall, medical clinic, and school for workers' children. He paid wages 20% above regional averages and provided health insurance. Progressive policies reflecting his belief that productive estates required satisfied workers. The total Ferncliff acreage peaked at approximately 2,600 acres by 1920, making it one of the largest consolidated estates in the Hudson Valley. But even as Vincent built, the economic forces that would destroy the Gilded Age estate model were accelerating. World War I brought inflation that increased operating costs while rent controls limited income from urban properties. The 1913 federal income tax, initially modest, saw rates climb to 77% on top brackets by 1918. Vincent, despite enormous inherited wealth, faced tax bills exceeding $2 million annually, roughly $60 million today. The 1916 federal estate tax meant that when the next generation inherited, they'd pay 40% on amounts over $5 million, requiring liquidation of assets to cover taxes. More fundamentally, the social structure supporting great estates was collapsing. Young women who once worked as housemaids took factory jobs with better pay, shorter hours, and more freedom. Men who might have been groundskeepers found opportunities in growing industries. By 1920, no amount of money could fully staff a mansion requiring 30 servants because people simply refused those jobs. Vincent's Ferncliff required permanent staff of approximately 60 just to maintain buildings and grounds, plus seasonal agricultural workers. Annual operating costs reached approximately $400,000 by 1920, roughly $6 million today, including staff salaries, maintenance, agricultural operations, taxes, insurance, and endless expenses of running a small principality. Even with agricultural revenue, Ferncliff consumed roughly 8% of Vincent's annual income. That was manageable for him, but the trend was unsustainable. Vincent's personal life deteriorated in direct proportion to his obsession with Ferncliff. In 1914, he married Helen Dinsmore Huntington, a Philadelphia socialite from an old money family. Helen initially embraced Ferncliff, participating in agricultural projects and hosting weekend parties that drew notable guests. But within 3 years, the marriage was troubled. Helen's letters to her mother, preserved in family papers, reveal growing frustration. Vincent spends every weekend at Rhinebeck, personally inspecting every barn, every greenhouse, every field. He checks account books obsessively, questions managers about minor expenses, and seems incapable of simply enjoying what he's built. I feel like I'm married to an estate rather than a man. By 1920, Helen was refusing to visit Ferncliff, remaining in the Fifth Avenue mansion or traveling to Philadelphia. She complained to friends that Vincent was haunted by his father's memory, and that intimate moments were interrupted by Vincent leaving suddenly to address some estate matter. They legally separated in 1925 and divorced in 1930. Helen remarried shortly after to Little Hull, a New York businessman, and by all accounts had a happy second marriage. She lived until 1976, dying at 83, a fact that underscores how normal her life after Vincent was. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression changed everything. Vincent's fortune, largely in real estate, saw property values collapse by 60–70%. Rental income evaporated as businesses failed and tenants defaulted. Manhattan office buildings stood half empty. Even for Astors, maintaining properties became financially painful. Ferncliff's operating costs remained constant around $400,000 annually, but now represented 25% of Vincent's reduced income rather than 8%. He implemented painful cuts. Staff reduced from 60 to 35, closing off sections of buildings to save heating costs, eliminating experimental agricultural projects, selling the Holstein herd and most of the poultry operation. The model estate Vincent had built to demonstrate productive luxury became just another drain on resources. He visited less frequently, sometimes going months without setting foot on the property, yet he refused to sell or dramatically reduce operations. Friends suggested donating Ferncliff to New York State as a park or agricultural college, but Vincent rejected these ideas vehemently. His diary from 1932 reveals why. "I cannot let go what father envisioned, what I built in his memory. To abandon Ferncliff feels like abandoning him a second time, letting him drown again while I watch helplessly." In 1930, Vincent married for the second time, Mary Benedict Cushing, a Philadelphia socialite known for her beauty and intelligence. Mary, called Minnie by friends, initially attempted to engage with Ferncliff, redecorating some rooms and hosting occasional parties. But she quickly recognized what Helen had learned. Vincent's relationship with the estate was pathological. Mary's private papers, opened after her death in 1985, include a devastating assessment written in 1935. Vincent doesn't own Ferncliff. It owns him. He cannot make decisions about his own life without first considering how they affect that property. He postponed a business trip to Europe last month because it was planting season and he needed to supervise. He is 53 years old and the wealthiest real estate heir in America, yet he acts like a farmer who might lose his land if he leaves for a week. I think he suffers from what doctors call obsessional neurosis, but he refuses to discuss it. Their marriage collapsed over the next 5 years. Mary wanted to travel, to engage with arts and culture in New York and Europe, to have a life beyond weekend house parties at a Hudson Valley estate. Vincent wanted to inspect barns, review agricultural accounts, and ensure his father's vision remained intact. They divorced in 1940 after a decade of increasing estrangement. World War II brought temporary reprieve through distraction. Vincent, too old for military service at 50, threw himself into war work. He donated the yacht Nourmahal to the Navy for submarine patrol, served on civilian defense boards, and managed war bond drives. Ferncliff's agricultural operations were briefly revived to support war food production, but on reduced scale. Vincent visited occasionally but largely left management to a skeleton staff. The estate sat substantially empty from 1941 to 1945, buildings closed, gardens simplified, only essential maintenance performed. This period actually reduced Vincent's psychological burden. With legitimate war-related reasons to neglect Ferncliff, he experienced less guilt about not maintaining his father's vision. His diary entries from the war years show noticeably better mental state. But the temporary reprieve ended when peace returned. In 1946, Vincent faced a stark reality. He was 54 years old, twice divorced, childless, and still burdened with an estate consuming resources without purpose. The post-war world had changed fundamentally. New taxes pushed his rate towards 70% on income. Labor costs had tripled since 1920, but servant availability had collapsed. A new generation viewed great estates as embarrassing relics rather than aspirational symbols. Vincent made a decision in 1946 that revealed both his inability to let go and his recognition that change was inevitable. He would marry once more and finally produce an heir to continue the Astor line. In 1953, at age 61, he married Brooke Russell Marshall, a New York philanthropist and socialite 28 years his junior. Brooke was intelligent, capable, and initially enthusiastic about taking on the Astor legacy. But she quickly encountered the same patterns that had destroyed Vincent's previous marriages. Her memoir, Footprints, published in 2002, describes visiting Ferncliff for the first time in 1954. The property was magnificent but melancholy, like a beautiful woman who'd been abandoned. Vincent showed me around for hours, describing every building, every improvement his father had planned, every change he'd made. He spoke about his father in present tense occasionally, as if John Jacob might walk into the room. I realized this marriage would be a triangle: Vincent, me, and a ghost who'd been dead for 42 years. Brooke attempted to engage Vincent in New York's social and cultural life, to draw him away from the psychological trap Ferncliff represented, but her efforts largely failed. Vincent spent increasing time at the estate, often alone, reviewing accounts and walking the grounds. Staff reported finding him talking to himself in the library, having one-sided conversations about decisions that needed making. The real crisis came in 1956, when doctors diagnosed Vincent with cardiovascular disease and warned that stress was life-threatening. Brooke pressed him to finally sell or donate Ferncliff to free himself from the burden consuming him. Vincent agreed intellectually but couldn't execute emotionally. He placed the estate on the market in 1957 at $2 million, approximately $21 million today, but rejected every offer, finding fault with each potential buyer. One wanted to subdivide for housing development, unacceptable desecration. Another planned to convert the buildings for corporate retreat use, too commercial. A third was a developer planning a golf course community beneath the property's dignity. Brooke recognized this as self-sabotage. Vincent claimed he wanted to sell but couldn't actually release the property. His diary from this period shows increasing confusion, entries that trail off mid-thought, repetitive passages about obligations to his father. In April 1958, Brooke discovered Vincent had stopped taking his heart medication, telling her, "What's the point of prolonging life when I've failed at everything that mattered?" She consulted psychiatrists who diagnosed severe depression and recommended hospitalization, but Vincent refused treatment. He told Brooke, "I inherited $70 million and 49 years later have done nothing but maintain what was given to me. I built nothing new, created no legacy, produced no heirs. My father died creating something. I've only presided over slow decline." Vincent Astor died on February 3, 1959, at age 66, from heart failure at his Fifth Avenue mansion. His death came after months of declining health, during which Brooke had desperately tried to get him proper medical care. The final weeks showed signs of dementia. Vincent repeatedly asked staff to prepare Ferncliff for his father's arrival, insisted his mother, dead since 1926, was coming to dinner, and became agitated when told these people were deceased. Brooke found a note he'd written days before his death. "Tell father I tried to finish what he began. Tell him the estate is ready for inspection. Tell him I'm sorry it's not grand enough." The funeral was attended by New York society, but noticeably absent were the two previous wives. Helen sent condolences but didn't attend, and Minnie was in Europe. Vincent's will revealed his final, tortured decision about Ferncliff. The estate was left to the Vincent Astor Foundation, with instructions to dispose of the property in whatever manner the trustees deem most beneficial to charitable purposes. He couldn't bring himself to order its destruction, but neither could he envision it continuing. The foundation tried for 2 years to find appropriate charitable uses. Cornell University declined to accept it as agricultural college campus, too expensive to maintain. New York State considered it for a park, but rejected it as too costly. Hospitals and schools examined it as potential institutional use, but found the buildings unsuitable for conversion. Finally, in 1963, the foundation sold Ferncliff to a development corporation for $750,000, barely a third of what Vincent had asked 6 years earlier. The buyer, a developer named William Zeckendorf Jr., had plans to create a luxury residential community. But the project was troubled from the start. Zoning disputes with Rhinebeck delayed development for years. When subdivision finally proceeded in the late 1960s, many of the original buildings were demolished. The dairy barns, greenhouses, staff cottages, most of the agricultural structures. Astor Courts, the Stanford White-designed main building, was preserved and sold as a private residence. It changed hands several times, falling into disrepair by the 1980s, before being purchased and meticulously restored. Today it operates as an exclusive private event venue and was famously the site of Chelsea Clinton's 2010 wedding to Mark Mesvinsky, an ironic historical echo with the child of a president married at an estate built by Gilded Age wealth. The property hosted 500 guests and multiple tents on the grounds, generating enormous media coverage that emphasized the fairy tale setting. Current owners maintain the buildings and approximately 50 of the original acres, charging premium rates for weddings and corporate events. The remaining 2,550 acres were subdivided over decades into various residential developments, though none became particularly prestigious communities, mostly middle-class housing that could be anywhere in the Hudson Valley. If Vincent Astor's story seems like isolated tragedy, it wasn't. His experience paralleled a pattern destroying hundreds of Gilded Age estates nationwide. The Vanderbilt family, America's wealthiest dynasty in the 1890s, saw their empire of mansions collapse within 2 generations. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's The Breakers in Newport, built in 1895 for $7 million, became unsustainable for the family by the 1940s. Annual property taxes of $10,000, roughly $125,000 today, plus maintenance costs of $50,000 annually, meant the house consumed $700,000 per year in modern currency just to keep standing. The family donated it to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948, retaining only private apartments on the 3rd floor. William Kissam Vanderbilt's Idle Hour on Long Island, built in 1900 at a cost of $5 million, was demolished in 1951 after standing just 51 years because no buyer could afford the maintenance, and the land was worth more for suburban development. Cornelius Vanderbilt III's mansion at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street in Manhattan, completed in 1893, was demolished in 1927 after only 34 years because the land was more valuable as commercial real estate than as residence. George Washington Vanderbilt's Biltmore in North Carolina survived only by pioneering a new model, opening to tourists in 1930, charging admission to offset the $250,000 in yearly operating costs the family could no longer afford from personal funds. Biltmore's success at commercialization ultimately saved it, though the Vanderbilt family had to accept that their private palace became a public attraction. The pattern extended beyond Vanderbilt's. Whitemarsh Hall outside Philadelphia, built by banker Edward Stotesbury for $3 million in 1921, featured 154 rooms and required a staff of 40 servants. After Stotesbury's death in 1938, his widow tried to maintain it, but sold in 1943 for just $200,000, a fraction of construction cost. The buyer, Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company, used it briefly for offices before demolition in 1980. Otto Kahn's Oheka Castle on Long Island, built in 1919 for $11 million and briefly the second largest private residence in America, was sold to New York City in 1948 for $100,000 and converted to institutional uses. By the 1970s, it stood abandoned and vandalized, nearly demolished before being rescued by a developer who converted it to a hotel. Duke Farms in New Jersey, built by tobacco magnate James Buchanan Duke, covered 2,700 acres with 9 greenhouses totaling an acre under glass, requiring 30 full-time gardeners. After Duke's death in 1925, his daughter Doris struggled to maintain the property for decades, finally donating it to a foundation in 1958. The reasons for this mass extinction were multiple and reinforcing. Federal income tax, introduced in 1913, reached confiscatory rates by 1950s. Top marginal rates peaked at 91% in the 1950s, meaning wealthy individuals paid virtually all additional income to taxes, leaving little for estate maintenance. Estate taxes, introduced in 1916, reached 77% on estates over $10 million by 1940, forcing heirs to liquidate properties immediately upon inheritance just to pay tax bills. But the more fundamental problem was social change. The servant class that made these houses livable simply disappeared. In 1900, domestic service was America's largest employment category for women. By 1950, it had dropped to under 5% of female workforce. Young women who once would have worked as housemaids took office jobs with better hours, higher pay, weekends off, and vastly more social freedom. Men who might have been groundskeepers or grooms found better prospects in factories, construction, or trades. By the 1930s, a butler who might have earned $50 monthly in 1900 commanded $250 monthly if you could find one willing to take the job, and most weren't. Running a house requiring 30 servants when servants essentially didn't exist made the grandest mansion unlivable regardless of owner's wealth. Property taxes also skyrocketed as municipalities realized estates represented massive untapped revenue. A mansion paying $2,000 annually in property tax in 1900 faced bills of $50,000 by 1950 as assessments rose and rates increased. In today's terms, that's $625,000 annually just for property tax before maintenance, staffing, utilities, or improvements. The combination was lethal. Income squeezed by federal taxes, inheritance devastated by estate taxes, operating costs exploding, servant labor unavailable, and property values declining because no one wanted to buy estates that couldn't be maintained. Between 1920 and 1960, over 75% of America's great Gilded Age estates were demolished, donated to institutions, or converted to other uses. The era of private palaces ended not because families lost fortunes, but because the social and economic ecosystem supporting such properties ceased to exist. Vincent Astor's tragedy was that he understood this intellectually, but couldn't accept it emotionally. His correspondence from the 1950s shows he grasped that Gilded Age estates were finished. that his father's vision of landed aristocracy was obsolete, that no amount of money could preserve Ferncliff as originally intended. But psychologically, he equated abandoning the estate with betraying his father's memory, failing the one obligation his inheritance demanded. The result was 49 years of mounting anxiety, 3 failed marriages to women who couldn't compete with a dead man's expectations, and ultimate recognition that he'd wasted his life trying to preserve something already lost. His final years showed a man crushed by burden rather than elevated by privilege. The curse of Ferncliff wasn't supernatural, it was psychological. Vincent inherited wealth his father died accumulating, creating guilt that no accomplishment could relieve. He spent his life trying to justify receiving what he never earned and never wanted. His father's death on Titanic meant Vincent's fortune came directly from life insurance payouts and estate liquidation following the tragedy. He inherited not just money, but trauma, obligation, and impossible expectations. Every dollar came with his father's metaphorical blood on it, purchased by drowning in the North Atlantic. The real horror wasn't ghosts or curses, but the weight of unearned inheritance in an era when old fortunes carried expectations their possessors couldn't fulfill. The contrast with successful estate preservation is instructive. Biltmore survived because George Vanderbilt's widow and daughter made a crucial decision. They would adapt the property rather than preserve it in amber. When opening to tourists in 1930, they accepted that Private Palace had to become public attraction. They added parking lots, gift shops, guided tours, all things that would have horrified the original builder, but which generated revenue making preservation possible. Each generation since has continued adapting, adding hotels, restaurants, a winery, retail operations. Today, Biltmore welcomes over 1 million visitors annually, employs 2,400 people, and generates approximately $200 million in annual revenue. It's still privately owned by Vanderbilt descendants, but it's also a major business that happens to be housed in a historic mansion. The property survives because each generation asked, "What does this property need to thrive?" rather than, "What would grandfather have wanted?" Winterthur in Delaware, built by Henry Francis DuPont, survived by becoming a museum of American decorative arts, giving it educational purpose beyond family vanity. Vizcaya in Miami, built by industrialist James Deering, was donated to Dade County and became a public museum and gardens. Even Hearst Castle in California was donated to California State Parks, becoming one of the state's most popular tourist destinations. The estates that survived became something new while respecting something old. Vincent Astor's fundamental error was trying to preserve grief rather than honor life. His father died at 47, cut off mid-stride, with unrealized plans and unfulfilled potential. Vincent spent 49 years trying to complete those plans, to build the vision his father never finished, to create the memorial that would justify the inheritance. But Jacob Astor IV likely would have adapted his own plans had he lived, responding to changing economics, evolving social conditions, new opportunities. Vincent, frozen in 1912, couldn't see that honoring his father meant continuing his innovator spirit, not preserving his specific ideas. A truly fitting memorial would have been converting Ferncliff into something productive and sustainable. An agricultural research center, a school teaching modern farming techniques, an experimental station for rural development. Such transformation would have honored Jacob Astor IV's engineering interests and progressive instincts while creating something useful rather than merely expensive. Instead, Vincent built a monument that nobody wanted, serving no purpose beyond consuming resources and causing guilt. 3 marriages failed because no wife could penetrate the wall Vincent built between himself and genuine emotional connection. The wall was constructed from obligation, guilt, and trauma, materials far more impenetrable than the limestone and brick of Ferncliff's buildings. Today, if you drive through Rhinebeck, New York, you can find the remnants of what was once Ferncliff. Astor Court stands beautifully restored, now hosting weddings and corporate retreats for clients who likely don't know its history. The surrounding subdivisions bear names like Astor Ridge and Ferncliff Estates, developer-invented appellations meant to add prestige but actually memorializing what was destroyed. Some original stone walls remain, cutting through suburban yards. Old-growth trees that once dotted agricultural fields now shade modern houses. The Hudson River still flows past, indifferent to human drama played out along its banks. And if the story has a moral, it's this: inherited wealth isn't always blessing. Great fortunes can become prisons, and sometimes the cruelest inheritance is receiving everything at the cost of someone's life. Vincent Astor inherited $70 million, 2,600 acres, social position, and historic properties. But he also inherited trauma, guilt, impossible expectations, and the psychological burden of justifying receiving what he never earned. That inheritance destroyed him as surely as if he'd drowned alongside his father in the North Atlantic. The real curse wasn't Ferncliff. It was the fortune itself, purchased with Titanic insurance money and his father's death, carrying obligation that no amount of preservation could fulfill. 7 people didn't die at the estate. 3 marriages didn't end in suicide notes, but one man spent his entire adult life slowly suffocating under the weight of inherited trauma, which is its own kind of death. Slower, perhaps less dramatic, but no less complete. That's the true horror of the palace the Astors built with Titanic blood. Not that it was haunted by ghosts, but that it was haunted by the living, unable to escape the past or embrace the future, trapped in eternal present of obligation and grief. Some inheritances are curses not because of what they are, but because of what they demand.